I didn't make most of the important decisions in my life. Fear did. That realization came much later, when the consequences were already permanent enough to hurt. At the time, it never felt like fear. It felt like logic. Like caution. Like being smart and responsible in a world that punishes mistakes. I told myself I was choosing wisely. In reality, I was choosing whatever hurt the least in the moment. Fear doesn't announce itself clearly. It doesn't always look like panic or weakness. Sometimes it looks like patience. Like planning. Like waiting for the right time that never quite arrives. I learned early how to avoid pain by avoiding choice. If an opportunity felt risky, I postponed it. If a desire felt inconvenient, I minimized it. If a decision might lead to regret, I chose nothing. Doing nothing felt safe. At first, I built my life around small, careful steps. Each one made sense on its own. Together, they formed a path I never consciously agreed to walk. I followed it because it was there, because others had walked it before, because it didn't require courage, only compliance. People praised me for being sensible. They said I was grounded. Mature. Thoughtful. I wore those labels like armor, never questioning what they protected me from. Fear thrives when it's mistaken for wisdom. I remember moments when my instincts pulled me in another direction. Sudden flashes of wanting something different, something uncertain. A different place. A different life. A different version of myself that felt frighteningly alive. Each time, fear stepped in calmly and said, "Not yet." Not yet when things are more stable. Not yet when you're more prepared. Not yet when you're sure. I believed it. Years passed inside that delay. I made decisions that kept my world small and predictable. I chose familiarity over growth, certainty over possibility. I stayed where I was needed instead of going where I felt called. I told myself that sacrificing desire was part of being an adult. What no one tells you is that repeated sacrifice without meaning slowly hollows you out. I didn't feel miserable. That's what makes this hard to explain. Misery would have forced change. I felt muted. Like someone had turned the volume of my inner life down just enough that I stopped noticing what was missing. Fear likes quiet environments. I noticed how rarely I felt excited about the future. How plans felt more like obligations than hopes. How I measured time by responsibilities instead of experiences. My days were full, but strangely empty. Still, I didn't resist. Fear had convinced me that this was safety. The first real crack came when I realized how often I imagined alternate versions of my life. Not fantasies, realistic possibilities. Choices I could have made. Paths I had actively avoided. Those thoughts used to feel optional. Now they felt like accusations. I started asking myself questions I had avoided for years. What would my life look like if fear hadn't been involved? Who would I be if I hadn't chosen safety every time? How much of my personality was actually just fear management? The answers scared me. Because they suggested something painful, that many of the limits in my life weren't imposed from the outside. They were self-selected. Carefully chosen. Repeatedly justified. I hadn't been unlucky. I had been cautious. And caution, when it governs your entire life, becomes a cage you don't notice until you try to move. I realized how often I had mistaken fear for instinct. How frequently I had ignored discomfort because it wasn't urgent enough to demand action. I told myself that if something was truly wrong, I would feel it clearly. But fear dulls clarity. It teaches you to tolerate dissatisfaction because dissatisfaction feels safer than the unknown. I began to feel a quiet grief, not for something I lost, but for something I never allowed to exist. A life that might have been messier, riskier, less controlled, but more mine. That grief didn't scream. It sat with me. And for the first time, fear couldn't talk over it. I understood then that my life hadn't unfolded naturally. It had been negotiated, moment by moment, by fear. And fear had always negotiated in its own favor. That realization didn't give me courage. It gave me responsibility. Because once you see that fear has been choosing for you, the question becomes unavoidable: do you let it keep choosing? Once I admitted that fear had been choosing for me, it stopped pretending. It became louder. More specific. More persuasive. Fear doesn't disappear when you expose it. It adapts. It learns new arguments. It starts sounding like concern for others, like responsibility, like realism. It reminds you of everything you could lose if you change course now. And by then, there was a lot to lose. I had built a life that depended on my predictability. People trusted me because I was consistent. I was the one who stayed. The one who didn't make sudden moves. The one who didn't disrupt the balance. That role came with approval. And approval is addictive when you've spent years earning it through self-denial. I started noticing how often my fear spoke in moral language. It would be selfish to change now. Other people rely on you. You've already invested too much time to start over. Those thoughts didn't feel cowardly. They felt responsible. And that's what made them dangerous. I began to see the real dilemma clearly. This wasn't just about fear versus courage. It was about loyalty versus truth. About whether I owed my life to the structures I had built, or to the part of me that had been suffocating inside them. Every option carried guilt. If I stayed, would continue betraying myself quietly, day after day. If I left, I would disrupt lives that had grown comfortable around my stability. Fear framed this as a moral test, and I failed it repeatedly by choosing the option that caused the least immediate discomfort. I stayed. Again. But staying no longer felt neutral. It felt like an active choice with a visible cost. I began to feel resentment toward my own life. Not dramatic resentment, subtle, poisonous resentment. The kind that shows up as fatigue, irritability, emotional distance. I wasn't angry at anyone else. I was angry at myself for noticing the truth and doing nothing with it. That anger frightened me more than fear ever had. Because anger implies energy. It demands movement. And I had trained myself to suppress movement. There were nights when I lay awake imagining conversations I would never have. Decisions I would never make. Explanations I would never give. Fear kept rehearsing worst-case scenarios, while another part of me whispered, what if the worst case is staying exactly as you are? That question wouldn't let me rest. I started to notice something else. Fear had not protected me from pain. It had only delayed it. The pain was quieter, slower, easier to ignore, but it was there. Accumulating. Hardening. Turning into regret before my eyes. I saw it in the way I talked about the future, with caution instead of curiosity. In the way I measured time by obligations instead of experiences. In the way joy felt conditional, temporary, always followed by the urge to return to safety. Fear had promised me security. What it gave me was limitation. I realized how rarely I had felt truly proud of my choices. I was proud of my endurance, my reliability, my ability to manage discomfort. But pride rooted in survival is thin. It doesn't nourish you. It only keeps you standing. I wanted something else. Not recklessness. Not escape. Ownership. I wanted to be able to say, honestly, this is my life, without feeling like I was borrowing someone else's script. The turning point wasn't dramatic. It didn't arrive with certainty or confidence. It arrived as exhaustion. I was tired of negotiating with fear. Tired of hearing its arguments. Tired of postponing myself in the name of responsibility. Tired of mistaking caution for virtue. That exhaustion stripped fear of its authority. I understood then that fear would never give me permission to change. It would always find a reason to wait, a justification to delay, a consequence to exaggerate. If I wanted a different life, even a slightly different one, I would have to choose without certainty. And that terrified me. But something else terrified me more. The idea of reaching the end of my life knowing that fear had made every important decision for me, and I had let it. I didn't want to be remembered as brave or bold. I wanted to be able to remember myself as present. That was when I stopped asking whether change was safe. I asked whether staying was honest. And for the first time, fear didn't have a convincing answer. The choice didn't feel like courage. It felt like standing still while fear finally lost its grip. I wish I could say there was a moment when everything became clear. When confidence arrived, when doubt disappeared, when I suddenly knew exactly what to do. That moment never came. What came instead was something quieter, and more final. I realized that fear would never leave me alone. It would always be there, adjusting its arguments, changing its tone, disguising itself as wisdom whenever it needed to. Waiting for fear to disappear before acting was the same as agreeing never to act at all. So I stopped waiting. Not because I was brave, but because I was tired of being absent from my own life. I didn't make a dramatic escape. I didn't destroy everything I had built. I didn't suddenly reinvent myself into someone fearless and free. That fantasy belongs to stories that end neatly. Real life doesn't. What I did instead was much smaller, and much harder. I took responsibility. I stopped saying, "This is just how things are," and started admitting, "This is what I'm choosing." That single shift changed everything. It removed fear's favorite weapon, plausible deniability. I could no longer pretend my life was happening to me. It was happening through me. And that was terrifying. Because once you own your choices, you also own their cost. You can't blame timing. You can't blame circumstances. You can't blame other people's expectations. If something feels wrong, it's your responsibility to address it. That weight nearly crushed me at first. There were days when I wished I could go back to ignorance. Back to the comfort of believing I had no choice. Back to the safety of letting fear decide quietly in the background. But I couldn't unsee the truth. Fear hadn't protected me. It had limited me. It had kept my world small enough to manage, but too small to inhabit fully. I began choosing differently in subtle ways. Saying yes to things that scared me, not recklessly, but deliberately. Saying no to things that drained me, even when fear whispered that I was being ungrateful or difficult. Each choice felt like walking without armor. Vulnerable. Exposed. Real. Some consequences arrived quickly. Certain relationships changed. Some people didn't recognize me anymore, or didn't like the version of me who hesitated less and questioned more. I lost approval I had once relied on. That loss hurt. But beneath it, there was relief. I was no longer negotiating my existence. I wasn't trying to earn the right to live my own life. I learned something important in those months: fear doesn't vanish when you stop obeying it. It just loses authority. It becomes noise instead of a commander. A signal instead of a sentence. I still feel fear. I just don't let it choose anymore. That distinction saved me. I stopped measuring my life by how safe it felt and started measuring it by how honest it was. Some days were harder. Less predictable. More uncertain. But they were no longer hollow. For the first time in a long while, I could feel time again, not as something slipping away, but as something I was participating in. Regret still visits me. I regret the years I spent waiting. The chances I never took. The version of myself I kept locked away because fear said it was impractical. But regret no longer paralyzes me. It reminds me why I refuse to go back. If there's one truth I carry now, it's this: fear will always offer you a life that looks reasonable and feels empty. It will promise safety in exchange for presence. Stability in exchange for truth. Approval in exchange for yourself. And it will keep its promises, just enough to trap you. I let fear choose my life for me for a long time. Not because I was weak, but because I confused fear with wisdom. The second chance didn't come from eliminating fear. It came from outgrowing it. From realizing that a life chosen entirely by fear isn't cautious, it's incomplete. If you're listening to this and you feel that quiet tightness in your chest when you think about the future, don't ignore it. Don't ask fear for permission. Don't wait to feel ready. Readiness is not a feeling. It's a decision. You don't need to become fearless to reclaim your life. You just need to stop letting fear speak last. That's how my life stopped being a negotiation. That's how it finally became a choice.